Hello, Brain Damage Philosopher here, and this is going to be an audio lecture that's a little different from the other ones that I've put on this channel so far, and that it deals with a less rigorous philosophical topic than epistemology or ethics or metaphysics. Instead, in this audio lecture, I'm going to be talking about aesthetics. This is actually a lecture that's precipitated by a 2-hour discussion I had with someone on one of the writing discords that I'm on yesterday night. And although I somewhat regret having that discussion in that the amount of time that I spent texting was way too much and I have a terrible headache this morning, even worse than I have had for the past few days, I don't regret having that discussion in the sense that it really helped me solidify and articulate my views on aesthetics and objectivity in art in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise had I not had an actively hostile audience. I say actively hostile because the person I was discussing with later admitted at the close of the discussion, which he actually started the close. He actually admitted that he was not willing to be convinced and could not be convinced under any circumstances. In essence, that he would refuse to hear any arguments made against his position. This is perhaps less of a bad position than you might think from hearing me say that, because he believes that for something to be objectively true, it must be automatically self-evident to all people. And so since he believes that his position is objectively right, then he believes that either I'm arguing in bad faith or that I'm automatically wrong. And in either case, if it was possible for him to be convinced otherwise, then the entire subject would have to be subjective, because for something to be objective, no argument should be able to convince you because it's self-evident to you. Now, obviously, this is incorrect. He's confusing the fact that there can be an objective fact of the matter and the fact that people can have beliefs about this objective fact of the matter that can be incorrect, and they can have their minds changed about the objective fact of the matter and switch their beliefs based on reasoning and evidence, because we are fallible beings that see the objective fact of the matter through the filter of our own epistemology and biases. But leaving that aside, the fact is that because he was so hostile to what I was trying to say, I was forced to articulate very carefully and in some depth my points. And so now I feel like I'm more prepared to handle making an audio lecture on this than I was before. Before I jump into describing my views on the subject, however, I want to talk about why I think this is important. I think having an objective standard in art is important because it's the only way to provide sort of a motivation to everyone who produces art to improve their skill in art. You see, if someone is unskilled in art, right, if they are, where the definition of skill is the ability to perform a task in the desired manner. So, if someone is unskilled in art, for instance, if they set out to draw a photorealistic drawing but end up drawing a stick figure, that can provide its own motivation. If they have a desire to do something which they are unable to currently do, obviously they'll have some motivation to improve their skills so that they'll be able to do the thing that they desire to do. But that's actually not something that you see very often with artists. Instead, with burgeoning artists, you often see instead an instinct to defend one's art at whatever skill level it was produced to the death and not want to change or improve, or because you don't want to admit that there needs to be a change or improvement. And so having an objective standard in art means that there can be someone who can make uh, statements about this person's art that are true, and they can make arguments for them that can actually convince the person who made the art um, that the art needs to change, even if they don't want to admit that it needs to change. Which is something that's not possible to do if it's subjective, because if it's purely subjective, then the very fact that the person who made the art doesn't want to admit that it should change means that it doesn't need to change. And so the ability to convince the person that made the art that their art needs to change or improve, even if even outside their feelings or opinions, which is the definition of objective, that opens up the possibility of motivating people even more to improve and produce art that they appreciate more. And because I think that people's enjoyment of art is linked to the objective qualities of the art, it'll motivate them to produce art that more people can enjoy, that more people can have a meaningful experience with, that can spark discussions in real life, that can improve even society and you know as well as individual people's lives, that people can build communities around, that can have lasting power, and so on and so forth. Because one of the things that I see commonly nowadays is the denial, and this is especially bad in the film art criticism circles, and less bad in the area of novels. One of the things that I see is the denial of the objectivity in art, leading to worse productions of art, and not just worse based on the objective standard that I'm going to propose, but worse in the sense that fewer people care or are interested in this art, and fewer people enjoy it and really get extra meaning out of it. They might enjoy it as just like something to do, filling the time, and so it's not going to be actively painful to consume the art that's being produced under this subjective regime. But people may not even know that they're missing out on the possibility of a more meaningful and even more enjoyable experience that would come from artists being motivated from the people around them to improve their art. Because only if there is an objective standard can someone convince someone else to change their art in any way. Okay, so with all that in mind, what is the objective standard in art that I propose? Well, I propose that it is possible to judge art based on how well it achieves the goals that it set out to achieve. You see, the definition of good is having the qualities required for a particular role. This is from the, let's see. Alright, yeah. So let's look at Merriam-Webster. Yeah. So the definition of good is having the qualities required for a particular role. For instance, this is a good chair because the chair has the qualities proper to a chair that allows it to fulfill the role that we expect of a chair. Now, alone, this definition of good does not provide an objective standard for judging art, because it could easily be said that the particular role that is expected of art is completely subjective to every person, and so whether art is good or not is relative to every person. I don't think that's necessarily true, however. Additionally, an art subjectivist could say that even if there is some sort of independent standard for art, that that isn't, different for every individual and therefore subjective to every individual. We can't judge whether a story meets any particular goal objectively. I disagree with that as well, and I'll talk about that in a second. So, to begin with, is there a way to establish a somewhat unified, or at least opinion and feeling independent sort of purpose or expectation that a certain piece of art can satisfy? Well, let's talk about stories in particular, because making things a little more concrete will make it easier to explain what I'm saying. So, when we talk about anything being good, right, we mean that it satisfies, it has what is necessary to satisfy the role that we expect of the thing, based on what the thing is supposed to be. So let's look at both sides of the coin. When an author is writing a story, the author themselves has a concept of the kind of story they want to write that includes properties and goals that they can either meet if they are skillful or fail to meet if they are not skillful. Since, again, the definition of skill is the ability to perform, to do something as, one desires to do it, right? So, a piece of a story. Okay, so an author, for instance, can set out to write a story that has consistent characterization and complex characters, and has a coherent plot where things happen for logical reasons. And if the author fails to perform that task, so lacks the skill to perform that task, and produces a story where our characters act out of character constantly, where many of the characters are one-dimensional, single-note, and bland and uninteresting, and where empires fall because of a sneeze, and blue pancakes fly through, or 1 + 1 = blue pancake. They have objectively failed to produce art that fulfills the role that was expected of the particular art piece that they made. So we can both say, if we can objectively ascertain whether the story achieves the qualitative standards that the author set up for the story when they were writing it, then we can objectively say that more or less skill went into making the story. And we can also say that the story is objectively more or less good because it objectively does or does not fulfill the expected role that that particular story was supposed to have. In much the same way that if someone is trying to make... Okay, well, hold on. So the problem at this juncture is twofold, right? First of all, this only really establishes that there can be objectively more or less skilled authors, not that the story that is produced with less skill is objectively better or worse. Because the role that we are using to measure whether the story fits, is relative or subjective to the person that's trying to write the story. This is still progress because we can now objectively say that people are more or less skilled because they objectively either can or cannot achieve the goals that they desire to achieve. But we still haven't reached objectivity in art. However, before I move on to talking about that, let's talk about something else. is it actually possible to objectively ascertain whether something satisfies a qualitatively assessed objective standard, a qualitatively assessed standard? Because many people, such as my interlocutor from yesterday night, believe that, at least before they are prompted, that the only thing that can be objectively determined is whether something meets a quantitative standard. However, I don't think this is true. I think that it is possible to objectively say that an author has put in, to objectively say whether a story is, for instance, consistent, whether or not you can put some kind of inconsistency level rating to the story or not. This all boils down to the fact that logic does not reduce to math, just as math does not reduce to logic. But yet we can objectively determine whether something is rational or not, even though you can't put a number to whether something is logical or illogical. Because it's a qualitative thing that you have to assess, whether the propositions are consistent and whether when the premises lead to the conclusion and so on. Similarly, but at a more complex level in the story, it is possible to objectively assess whether the rules that a story puts out, are actually followed throughout the rest of the story, and whether characters act in ways that are inconsistent to how they were previously characterized, and so on. Likewise, I think it is possible to objectively look at how much complexity an author actually put into the characters of the world building and so on, even if we can't assign numbers directly to it. Of course, there will be gray areas here, because reading the text does require interpretation, and there can be things that people miss or read into the text that weren't there, which make it a little difficult to exactly determine to what degree something holds up to a qualitative standard, objectively speaking. However, that just means that there are error bars on the assessment of skill, of the skill of any author. Not that it cannot be determined at all. There are error bars even in the hardest of sciences. In fact, some of the hardest sciences actually have very large error bars, such as with physics, and quantum physics, for instance. So error bars does not mean that something isn't objective. Additionally, a art subjectivist could try to point out that it's impossible to actually... Well, an art subjectivist will often talk about the fact that it's possible for a reader to find meaning in a text that wasn't put there by the author, and that may not be possible for other people to find in it. However, I don't find this to be a very interesting point with regard to the actual qualities of the text, since if this meaning is... If the ability to find this meaning is more tied to the individual person than what was actually put in the text by the author, then talking about that meaning tells us more about the people who read it than the text itself, and what I can be sure, or more reasonably certain to be able to derive from the text. Additionally, I think that oftentimes people will stretch very far to get a certain meaning out of a text that wasn't put in. And that can have, I think, different things that we can say about the text can have more or less evidence from the text to indicate that they are actually in the text. If you derive a grand theme that you believe weaves throughout the story but can only reference a single line that could possibly be interpreted as talking about that, that means you have less evidence to say that that theme is in the story than someone who can talk about many instances for every character or every event where a certain theme plays out. And so essentially, although it's possible that you are correct that that theme is in the story, even if you have less evidence, just like you are possibly correct about something being real, even if you have less evidence that it is real, just as in the case with real-world things, the less evidence you have, the less your statements about the thing that you have, that you're talking about, have to tell me about the thing, the less sure I can be that it's actually there, and the more sure I can be that it's probably just more something that's about you than the text itself. So when we discuss a text and someone's talking about the meaning that they were able to derive from it, that's not super interesting to me unless they can provide a lot of evidence from the text that means that the meaning is actually in there. Because, otherwise, I can't really know whether they're actually talking about the text or just something within themselves. A reductio ad absurdum of this art subjectivist argument that I often like to use is to say that I can derive really deep themes about self-actualization and industrialization and the connections with other people that we have when we live in a society and how that relates to self-actualization from Robert E. Howard's Conan stories. But I don't think they're actually there. Or at least not to the extent that I could derive them. And so if you can derive deep themes with an equal amount of stretching from any piece of literature, then I take if you do a certain amount of stretching to get a theme from a certain text, and an equal amount of stretching can derive any theme from the same text, or the same theme from any other text, I have less reason to think that that theme is actually related to that text in any way, instead of being related to you. And what this means is that, although it can sometimes be different because of our subjective biases and different strengths and weaknesses in how we read texts, because of these things, it can be difficult to objectively determine whether something is in a text or not in order to determine whether it objectively meets some qualitative standard. I think that it is still possible to do based on the amount of evidence that someone can provide from a text for or against it actually having some qualitative property. But let's move on. So I've established that we can objectively determine whether something meets a qualitative standard. And I've also said that we can objectively determine, because of that, whether an author is more or less skilled. However, that still doesn't mean that we can objectively determine whether a piece of art is good or bad, or better or worse. So how do I get there? Well, there are certain things that we expect from a story. If there weren't things that we expect, how definitions work is that they list a few properties that we can use to identify something which other people and ourselves would be willing to use the label that has those properties for, right? And so that means that when we call something a name, we are saying that it satisfies certain properties. And so if someone says that something is, for instance, a story, I can reasonably expect that it will satisfy the certain properties that will allow me to identify it as a story. If there are no particular properties that make something a story, then I would be unable to determine whether anything is a story, and the word would be meaningless. I wouldn't be able to tell whether something was a story or not, obviously we can tell whether something is a story or not, which means that the word has meaning, which means that it's talking about that it must have certain properties that do not universally obtain that determine whether the word story can be applied to something and whether it can't be. Because again, this is how definitions work. Definitions have a list of properties that determine the conditions under which we can apply a label to something. What this means is that if we call something a story, then if it the degree to which it does satisfy the properties that we expect from the definition of what a story is determines whether it is a good story or not, since the definition of good is whether something satisfies, a particular, how well something satisfies a particular role. So if something is a good story, that means it has, the properties that allow it to satisfy the definition of what a story is to some degree. And if it's a bad story, then it doesn't have those properties. And so and bringing in the points from before, even if the definition of story is a qualitative definition, if we can objectively determine whether something satisfies a qualitative standard, that means that we can objectively determine whether something satisfies the properties of a story, and which means that we can objectively determine whether something is a good story or not. So, what are the properties that we expect from a story? Let's see. Well, in general, what we expect from a story is a narrative. And what is a narrative? Well, a narrative is an account of a series of connected events that can be real or imaginary. What this means is, and this is all very general, but what this means is that if, for instance, someone tries to write a story and it fails to clearly communicate what the events are that are taking place, or has no events, right, then obviously it's not a good story. Likewise, if the events are disjointed or disconnected in some way, if they are too disjointed or disconnected at least, then it might be a worse story than one where all of the narrative, the events in the narrative, can be joined up and make sense as a whole. Of course, this is a very general thing, so let's drill down, because people don't just write stories. They write novels. They write fantasy or science fiction or literary fiction or historical fiction. And all of these things come with specific expectations of what it should be like. When people go into reading a novel, they expect like each sort of genre and each sort of goal of writing, like each kind of book or story or novel, has its own sort of properties and expectations that people have about what it is. And something can either succeed or fail at living up to those, right? When I read a novel, part of the idea of a novel, well, the definition of a novel is a fictitious prose narrative of book length, typically representing character and action with some degree of realism. This means that when I go into a novel, I want characters that the part of the thing that is expected for something that fulfills the role of a novel. Part of the definition of what a novel is having a character that is consistent and that makes actions in a world where those actions, make sense and that reacts to that character, that perhaps has some kind of conflict that drives the narrative forward and keeps me interested, right? I expect that from most of the the genre books that I read, right? And so if something has a conflict but undermines the conflict or doesn't have a conflict, right, that is worse at being a sort of genre book, right? Or if it has a character that makes inconsistent decisions, a character that doesn't make sense, or where things are not depicted with any degree of logical coherency, let alone realism, then it's worse at being a novel, right? See, this is the thing, is that the definitions of words, of what role a thing is trying to fulfill, determine the expectations that we have for something, and something can objectively succeed or fail at satisfying those expectations. And so, something can objectively be a better or worse, a good or bad novel, or a better or worse or good or bad story. Now, of course, these definitions are pretty general, and so an art subjectivist might say, well, these definitions are so general, it's hard to really get a lot of prescriptive, statements about art from them. And with this, I actually agree. There is a very wide range of good art, much wider than I think conservatives would be willing to admit. And so, but I think that there still remains a core of objectivity to it that we can use to criticize something. And the more specific it is clear, the more specifically clear it is that something is trying to fulfill a certain role, the more leeway we get to objectively criticize it. For instance, if I'm criticizing a particular book, I can say, well, for instance, this book is trying to have realistic politics and, but it really comes across as juvenile and uninteresting, such as The Well of Ascension in the Mistborn trilogy. And that's an objective criticism that makes it a worse story, an objectively worse book than some other book, because it is objectively worse at satisfying the role that it was attempting to fulfill than perhaps Dune is at satisfying the role that it was attempting to fulfill. Part of what this means, though, is that there even within this objectivity, there is it's like the Tao thing, where like you have a little tiny spot of black within the white and a tiny spot of white within the black, because just as there's a kernel of objectivity within subjectivity, there's a kernel of subjectivity within objectivity, because, or not within, but there's still a complex component of subjectivity to this objectivity, because if something perfectly achieves the role that it set out to fill, then it is on the same footing as any other thing that perfectly achieves the role it set out to fulfill. And so this is why, for instance, I would hold Army of Darkness, the Sam Raimi movie, up as objectively as good as 2001: A Space Odyssey, because 2001: A Space Odyssey and Army of Darkness both objectively fulfill well the specific roles that they were trying to fulfill. 2001: A Space Odyssey is trying to be a highbrow, thought-provoking, artistic, a very aesthetically pleasing science fiction film, and it does that to a T. Army of Darkness is trying to be a wildly entertaining sort of love letter to pulp, sword and sorcery fantasy, and it does that really well, possibly even better than 2001 does at its goal, right? but we can objectively determine the degree to which something fulfills a goal, which means that it can be good or bad or better or worse, because we define good or bad, better and worse based on how well something fulfills the expected role, and we can compare how well different things achieve their own goals, right? Now, I don't really want to do this, but The Last Jedi kind of has to come up in any discussion of objectivity in art criticism, so I guess I have to go there. The purpose that I think The Last Jedi set out to achieve was to deconstruct the legacy of Star Wars and also providing a new, more artistic direction for Star Wars. And on the one hand, I think that it did an amazing job providing a new artistic direction. Like, I will never ever deny that The Last Jedi is among the most aesthetically pleasing, visually movies that I've ever seen. Up there with 2001 and Age of Ultron and so on. However, I think that it actually failed to do a proper deconstruction of Star Wars' legacy. It relied on devices that simply didn't do the job very well. It didn't provoke a lot of thought. It didn't wrestle with the themes in the way that a deconstruction is supposed to do, and so on. It just kind of shat all over them and assumed that it had satisfied its goal. Furthermore, it did still have the goal, the expected role of being a good story. And because of the way it tried to deconstruct things, it sacrificed a lot of character consistency and what little, and plot coherency, which we expect from a story, expect from a narrative, and expect from a story that's supposed to be, sort of an action-adventure thing, right? Which is what they were still trying to do. So in conclusion, I think it is possible to objectively determine, within some error bars and with some nuance, but still overall objectively determine to what degree something satisfies a qualitative standard. This means that it is objectively possible to determine how well an author is able to achieve the qualitative goals that they set for themselves. And since we define skill based on the capability to achieve the end that you desire, that means that we can objectively determine how skilled an author is. On the flip side, with art itself, we can objectively determine we can objectively determine how well a piece of art satisfies the expected role that it was intended to, that comes from the definition of the kind of art that it's supposed to be. A definition that everybody agrees on, that is sort of allows us to determine what that kind of art is in the first place. And so I think it is possible to say that something is an objectively good or bad story, an objectively good or bad novel, an objectively good or bad action-adventure film. And the more specific the goals of something are clearly demonstrated, the more specific and the more possibility there is for objective criticism. Nevertheless, on the other hand, there's no real way to objectively say that, for instance, a novel that perfectly fulfills a very highbrow role, there's no real way in which it is objectively better than a novel that is specifically designed to satisfy a lowbrow goal. we might think that one or the other has more value to the people that watch it, or to society, or so on. But that's a different discussion. That verges more on ethics than aesthetics. So yeah, I think that's kind of all I wanted to say.